Professor Tamer. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and join my esteemed colleagues who spoke before me. Thank you for organizing this great workshop, and thank you for your team. I'm not going to be mentioning them individually, but I nod for all the efforts that you all have done in making this meeting go smoothly. And I have organized countless conferences and workshops, and I know how much work they require. So I tip my hat for the great work you have done in organizing this, these 3 days for us. And I'm very cognizant, at least as speakers are concerned, that I'm the last. So please bear with us for another hour before we can go and have our halal beer somewhere. The Hanat Erlangen. So I have as my beloved French scholars would say, avant-propos, that is some kind of a warning that follows on the heel of several comments that have been expressed in the last 2 days, especially Dr. Firestone's introduction when he gave his the first lecture in this workshop. I say that any investigation of the topic of just war in Islam has to start with the problem of the question itself. On the one hand, just war, as we just saw with the presentation before, started as a Christian, Roman Christian concept and developed very well in Christian theology in the Middle Ages. And as such, it carries a Christian garb. On the other hand, it has become, in the last century, a major component of international law. And in this respect, it carries a well-defined legal parameter. So the awareness of these two facts is very important, because, at least in theory, they help the scholar avoid serious historical anachronisms when looking for the concept in other religious traditions or cultures. And I think many of my colleagues have pointed out to this issue. This does not mean that we cannot find quasi-similar concepts, but we need to be careful not to take the concept of just war according to its strict Christian definition or international law definition and look for it elsewhere. We must understand the concept very broadly. In its most basic meaning, just war means a war that is considered just, which raises two problems: how to define war, and how to define, or who defines, justness. The great theorist of international law, Lasse Oppenheim, who died in 1919, for instance, defined war in his seminal work on international law in the following manner: war is a contention between two or more states through their armed forces for the purpose of overpowering each other and imposing such conditions of peace as the victor pleases. One realizes right away two main problems in this definition. First, it's very Eurocentric in the sense that it limits itself to wars between defined states and did not take into consideration other forms of wars, including European wars outside of Europe at that time, which were mostly against groups and not states. Second, peace is tied to the dictate of the victor rather than to an objective standard. But this is not the venue to criticize Oppenheim here. The point is that we cannot take the modern definition of war, which is already facing serious challenges, especially since 9/11, and with what we famously call the war on terror, because it doesn't technically fit into the modern definition. So there has been a lot of criticism to the definition of war as we have it. We cannot take that as our starting point for the investigation of just war in Islam. The problem are further magnified when we add the term Islam, which is a mosaic of beliefs, for at no point Islam had a well-defined theology or dogma on pretty much any issues around which the Muslims collectively agreed, including the concepts of war and justice. In other words, when we talk about Islam, we can only talk about Islamic thought as produced by Muslim groups or individuals who aspired to define a position on a given issue, albeit often inherently inconclusive. I say inconclusive in that classical Muslim scholars often accepted as a premise the disagreement among them as an integral component of Islamic thought, and therefore the diversity of valid opinions. Therefore, investigating just war in Islam requires either investigating the mosaic of Islamic beliefs and doctrines around war, which leads to many often contradictory answers, or limiting the inquiry to a specific Muslim sect, in which case we should say just war according to that sect. These concerns do not, however, invalidate the exercise as such, but in my opinion are very important in order to properly recenter the question and the discussion. The question should be, is there something comparable in Islamic thought to the concept of just war broadly defined? In my opinion, this different way of asking the question sidelines the problem, which we often come across in Islamic studies in general, and further also in comparative study of religion, where we see a constant effort to compare concepts across religious traditions and impose inadvertently a hegemony of one tradition over the others, and worse still, allow the tendency to interpret this to mean that one tradition that already has this concept is superior to the other, and something that Professor Feiston already invoked by saying no comparison is without valorization, and that often loaded issues is that we assume in the comparison that inherently one is better than the other, especially around these things when one concept is very much developed in one tradition and we go struggle to find it in another tradition and we come short. I also want to avoid the modern trap that some scholars inadvertently fall to, namely anachronism. This often takes the form of looking, for example, from the Islamic tradition that might seem adequate to a concept under investigation, take them out of context, use them as a proof of the existence of the concept in Islam, and ignore the contrary evidence or the diversity of opinions that demonstrate the complexity of the discussions among Muslims. In what follows, therefore, I'm going to look at the way Muslim thinkers across the centuries have discussed war, especially the laws around the causes and purposes of war, which translate in Latin to jus ad bellum, or jus ad bellum, and on the other hand, what is permitted to be done during the war, that is the conduct of war, and the conduct of warriors, which correspond largely to the expression jus in bellum. It's also pertinent to include in this a discussion of just war in the sense of the duty to fight in God's name, irrespective of causes and conduct, because in my opinion, this too should be taken into consideration when talking about this conceptualization of just war in Islamic thought. I will avoid, by the way, giving a linear presentation of the topic under discussion, because I do not believe that such a presentation is very informative. And often, especially in Islamic studies, we have this tendency to start with the Quran and go linearly, and inadvertently give the wrong impression as if there is cause-effect here. And that's precisely why I'm going to probably leave the Quran toward the, not the end, but close to the end before modernity, in order to undermine this tendency to do that. And what emboldens me a little bit in that respect is, and you're going to see some of my arguments that I'm going to be sharing with you, is it's not really the fact in Islamic thought that the Quran was always the starting point, or the final reference, or the final voice on some issue. One scholar of Islamic law actually said it, Muhammad Ali Amir Muazzi, he's a professor in Paris, at the Institut des Hautes Études, if I'm not mistaken, who said that the Muslim jurists often did things in spite of the Quran. And that is very loud, very politically incorrect, but really when you examine the tradition, you realize that the jurists often either ignored the Quran, didn't bother to look into it, or when they encountered something in the Quran that didn't like it, they came up with a huge toolbox of what we call hermeneutical tricks in order to make the Quran say what they want rather than what the Quran is saying. So I'm going to start my presentation a little bit with the Islamic legal tradition. Because essentially, this is where we see things that we can say comparable in the sense that here are evidence that the Muslims are starting to think of the causes, the right causes of the war, and the right conduct of the war. It starts with a question presented to the chief judge of Baghdad. His name is Abu Yusuf, who died in 798, by the famous Caliph Harun al-Rashid, who reigned from 786 to 809. And he wrote down the question in his book on law, Abu Yusuf, and said, "You ask, O Commander of the Faithful, about the polytheists. Are they to be summoned to Islam before war, or are they to be fought without any summoning? What is the common practice regarding their summon and fighting, and the enslavement of their offspring? Also, what about the war against the evil dissenters from among the Muslims? Are they to be summoned to Islam and to join the community before they are fought? And how about the properties of those who are defeated?" So pretty much, the Caliph is concerned about justification and about conduct. And the answer of Abu Yusuf is extremely telling in that. So he right away starts his answer by saying, "According to the traditions that have reached us, the messenger of God never fought a tribe until he first summoned them to obey God and his messenger." So you think that's the condition of war, is to first summon them to Islam, and if they say no, sorry, then you can launch war against them. But the next sentence, essentially, he changed course completely. He says, "Some jurists and successors, that is the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, that is the second generation after him, maintain that polytheists everywhere who were reachable by Muslim troops, that all those people who are around the Muslim land, who could be fought by the Muslims, have already heard of Islam and the summon to Islam, and therefore the Muslims are at liberty to fight them without the need to summon them to Islam." And he listed two hadiths by companions of the Prophet Muhammad in which this is the case, that you don't need to summon people to Islam anymore. And he adds two more hadiths by the Prophet Muhammad in which actually he fought people without summoning them to Islam. So what do we get from this legal discussion that Abu Yusuf is giving us? One, he doesn't list the Quran at all. There is not a single verse from the Quran that he cited in his answer to the Caliph. And that, in the first 2 centuries, is not completely surprising, by the way. Later on, it becomes surprising, but at that time, it wasn't at all surprising that a jurist of that magnitude would answer without necessarily even bother to look at the Quran. But he also admitted that the teachings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad are inconsistent. There is hadith that he says he never attacked people without summoning them to Islam, and there are hadiths that said that actually he did. And he also plainly acknowledged that Muslim jurists no more consider the period of the Prophet Muhammad as applicable. That is, what the Prophet Muhammad did were things applicable to him, and now in this new reality, there is a new approach to this notion of war. You don't need to go and justify. Obviously, this is one opinion among many about war that you have, but at least you see here a reasoning of how you think about law, in this particular case, about the question of war. Just to give you a little bit about the significance of this fellow, Abu Yusuf. He was the chief judge of the capital of the empire of the Abbasids. He was also the actual effective founder of what we call the Hanafi school. He and his younger disciple called Al-Shaybani. Both of them were students of the famous Abu Hanifa. And often we say Abu Hanifa is the eponym of the Hanafi school, but it was actually Abu Yusuf and Al-Shaybani who formed that school. So he is a person of tremendous juristic authority, and the position that he took on the question of war became very normative in the Islamic tradition. They were not the only views, but they became very normative. This leads me to look more into Islamic law in search for that discussions of war and the conduct of war, and the causes of war, and what constitutes just cause versus non-just cause. What can be done, or be done under that. And here I'm going to turn to the famous Andalusian philosopher and jurist Averroes, Ibn Rushd. And Ibn Rushd, actually, he wrote a very huge manual of Islamic law called Bidayat al-Mujtahid wa Nihayat al-Muqtasid, the starting point of the seeker and the end point of the thrifty, or the lazy, if one were to say. In this, he has a book on jihad. It's cut into different topics. Each topic has pretty much close to what we consider to be around 70 pages. And the book on war, on jihad, is one of those. It's divided into sections, one about the war, and the other one is about booty, and how to divide booty, how to collect it. But there is no category as such, for instance, of just war. We need to go and patch it from here and there. So probably there are up to 6 different categories. Collectively, you can put them under that kind of just war. So who to fight, why to fight, how to fight, things like that. For instance, under a category entitled the condition of war, Ibn Rushd contended that the pretext of war is to summon people to Islam. That's for him what would make a war justified. Is first you have to summon them to Islam. If they say no, then you might be able to proceed. But then there are still lots of other conditions that you have to fulfill, and he goes on to list all of those. He alleged that all jurists agree with him on this, and we just saw with Abu Yusuf that's not. So that's sometimes the nature of lots of these juristic arguments, is that they might exaggerate how representative their opinions. But he acknowledged actually the disagreement among jurists pretty much on every topic that he discussed. Every time he would say, for instance, are we allowed to kill civilians? He said, there is this view and there is that view. And the reason that we have these two views are because either there is this verse in the Quran that contradicts that verse in the Quran, or that there is this verse in the Quran that contradicts something that the Prophet said, or something that the Prophet said contradicts with something that he did, or that something that the Quran said is contradicted by the first Caliph Abu Bakr and so on. And these are some of the arguments that you would find in his chapter on jihad, that essentially means that he didn't feel that he could give one position about war to the exclusion of the other opinion that were already prevailing. And those include what type of people you can fight. Are there exceptions? For instance, do you fight all people equally? The answer is there is disagreement. There is yes and there's no. The no says there are exceptions. There are people of the book that you cannot fight. You can only summon them to pay the jizya. You cannot summon them even to Islam. In the whole discussion, there is no accommodation for summoning the people of the book to Islam. You only summon them to pay the jizya. Yeah? And only if they reject that, then you might be able to fight them. But then even that category of the people of the book, there is this disagreement whether it is only Christians and Jews, or it also includes Zoroastrians, Abyssinians. At the time, Turks were not converted, the Turks and the Indians, etc. So it becomes very problematic whether it is limited to a specific group or it can be extended. So for instance, the Malikis, the school to which Ibn Rushd belongs, it's one of the schools of Sunni Islam, he accepts taking jizya from anybody, extending the door. Whereas the Shafi'i school said only from the people of the book and the Zoroastrians. So you see here, and that defines therefore the type of just war you can launch, because there are certain groups that the only way they can avert a war against them is if they accept the summon of Islam. That would be the only way out. There is also a discussion about when you fight the enemy, what can you do to the captives, and who can extend some kind of a guarantee of security to the enemy when they say, for instance, and there is this caveat, by the way, it's predicated on something that is mentioned in the Quran, but it's also part of the practice that while you are fighting, the enemy, for instance, screams and said, I want to convert to Islam. Yeah? And there is this lull moment between their intention and their actual conversion, in which case someone has to extend to them what in Arabic we call aman, yeah? A guarantee of safety. Okay, who can issue that aman? And then he tells us there's a huge debate among jurists. Some say only the imam, that is the leader of the Muslims. It could be the caliph or his deputy who's leading the fight. And he says, others would say a woman can issue an aman, a slave can issue an aman, and there is debate over who can do that. And all of this actually translates into what type of perception of this conduct of war that one gets. And similarly, you have the same kind of debate in Shiite law, almost minor nuances here and there, not major disagreements that you find to this diversity that you find in Ibn Rushd. The only exception is that in Shi'i discussions of the conduct war and the cause of war, invariably they are tied to the imam. Only the imam can authorize the launch of the war. And that is, you have to wait. It's not you as a Muslim who can determine whether a war needs to be done or not. It's the imam who can launch that. And the imam can launch that. Often it's defined into different kinds of people. There are the non-Muslims, and also there are, if you remember, in the question to Abu Yusuf, there is what about the war against the evil dissenters from among the Muslims? You know, these are either political rebels or insubordinate, people essentially that cause tremendous harm to the internal Muslim community by political or military kind of act. And again, in Shia manuals, there are disagreements on that. But what we find in one particular early Shia manual on law by a famous Shia jurist called Al-Kulaini, is that he gives us two definitions, one tied to a Shiite imam, the fifth Shiite imam, in which supposedly in a letter to an Umayyad caliph in the early 8th century, this fifth Shiite imam, Al-Baqir, said that war has motives and objectives and has a conduct. And its motives, objectives, and conducts must center around safeguarding the borders of the Muslim territories and summoning people to obey God or pay the jizya or convert. But then, in another place, he quotes Imam Ali, first of the Shiite caliphs, saying that God imposed the duty of jihad, which is warfare, because the world and religion cannot be straightened except by it. So it becomes the medium through which to make sure that everything in the world functions in the proper order. So that is the way at least Al-Kulaini attributed to Imam Ali this idea of what is the purpose of the war. I have other Shiite discussions, but I'm not going to engage with them for the sake of time. I'm going to move to another Sunni scholar, very important Sunni theologian from the Crusader period, in order to underscore that not every scholar in Islam actually, when they wrote on jihad and war, they were cognizant of or bothered at all about the whole notion that relates in one way or another to just war and how to conduct yourself in a war. If they were to, for instance, Ibn Asakir was asked by the Sultan at the time, Sultan Nuruddin, who was the predecessor of Saladin, probably you're familiar more with Saladin. So Nuruddin asked Ibn Asakir to write a booklet on jihad. And he specifically asked, write a booklet on jihad that is based on the hadith of the Prophet Muhammad. Yeah? And Ibn Asakir included 40 hadith. It's a very short treatise. There is not a single hadith that discusses conduct of war or reason for war. But he hints to it in the introduction. He wrote this in order to help the fighters, jihad fighters, to truly perform when they meet the enemy in battle and incite them to uproot the unbelievers and tyrants. So you think that war is against tyranny and unbelief because of the unbelief and because of the terrorism in the land. So you might conclude from that he associated war with the end of tyranny and with the end of unbelief. But in his discussion of the war and in the actual hadith, there is not a single one that discusses any of those factors. So therefore, it's not always the fact that what we see in the legal tradition, these kind of discussions, that necessarily we are going to be seeing them mirrored elsewhere. And similarly the case, if you look at examples from the Sufi tradition, the legacy of Sufism regarding war is, I would say, to put it mildly, it's mixed legacy. There is a two. There is emphasis on what we call the spiritual journey and spiritual jihad, but jihad in the path of God is very clear. It means often warfare. And in this particular discussion by Ghazali, earlier Professor Tamer mentioned one thing where Ghazali justified war for the protection of the pilgrimage and pilgrimage routes. And here in particular, he compared, actually in his Ihya Ulum al-Din, in his revivification of the religious sciences, he constantly compared warfare to other major, to fasting for instance. And I would say fasting in comparison to warfare is like drinking a cup of water in comparison to drinking the sea, in which warfare is much more difficult. Somewhere else where Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy al-Munkar, commanding right and forbidding wrong, no, then jihad becomes the cup and the commanding right and forbidding wrong becomes the sea, something that's much, much huge. But constantly he's comparing these two, and in this particular case he's giving us this discussion about the Sufi master should recognize whether the murid, the student, the disciple is worthy of being initiated through this journey. If you realize that they don't have the mental capacity to do it, you need to do to them very similar, as you see in a second, very similar to the person who cannot fight, who in order to get the reward of the warriors, he has to serve them in the war. So you see here that kind of comparative imagery that in a sense that the logic of warfare always existed in the universe of the Sufis, and often actually they would borrow the terminology of warfare into their own mystical exercises. But invariably, it's always pitched in the context of reaffirmation of the right creed that you would find affirmed, broadly speaking, in the Islamic tradition. Philosophy-wise, so excuse me, I'm jumping into different categories, but at least to give you as broad a spectrum, and that is going to tie to my conclusion that there is really no just war theory in Islam. There are ideas expressed that we need to bring them from here and there and try to put them together, see do they make one, and I don't think they necessarily make one, because each one has a different opinion about what is the objective of war. The philosopher Al-Amiri, who died in 992, is actually one of the earliest to discuss war, and earlier Professor Tamer mentioned Muallim al-Awwal was al-Farabi? Thani, sorry, Thani. So it's after Aristotle. Aristotle, yeah. So seminal as a philosopher. Al-Amiri essentially divided war into three categories. He said there is jihad, and there is national or ethnic conflicts, and there is pillaging. And obviously, only jihad is a just war. That is a war that has the agreement of scholars that it is a proper war. All others are violations that are violence, in one way or another. Forms of violence that essentially he didn't want to get himself to. So what is the purpose of jihad? What's the objective of jihad? And he tells us essentially, and it's extremely telling, he contended that if one were to examine the military career of the Prophet Muhammad, it becomes apparent that his objective from war was for people to admit God's oneness and his revelation. Once they did that, he stopped fighting them and protected them. And he compared the Prophet wars to a physician who is obliged to amputate a limb or an organ in order to save the patient's life. So hence he said, the Prophet during his raids killed a number of people in order to save the multitude from perdition and degeneration, for he was certain that those forced at first to follow religion, once they realized its true merits having been enlightened by its glow, they would be immensely thankful to him. So essentially this gives us some very clear idea about how Al-Amiri understood the purpose of war. It is the lesser evil in order to make sure that humanity worships God and accepts his guidance. It is the prompt in one way or another that brings back humanity to the fold of God. And here I'm gonna veer back to a little bit of a discussion of the Quran. 5 minutes, 10 minutes? I can.
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, I'll try to stay away within 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
War is a reality in the Quran. There is no doubt about that. The text regularly reminds its audience of their duty to fight in God's way, but at no point does it lay out a clear vision about war to allow us to say that the Quran's view of just war is such and such. As I noted earlier, medieval scholars invariably realized the inconsistency of the Quran regarding the question of war. More importantly, as far as we can tell, the Quran was not the starting point of Islamic thought regarding war. It gradually gained importance after many views have been established, and scholars would go to the Quran in order to validate those views vis-a-vis others. So, in what follow, I'm going to talk about some of the most important verses that's quoted in the Quran, in order to see if we can deduce from them what could be motives for war. If there are kinds of motives, can we bracket them into categories? And my objective also is to show that in the Quran there is certain uncertainty about war, its objective and its content. Something like an inherent struggle in the text between God's mercy on the one hand and war as a tool to force humanity to worship God and obey Him on the other hand. There is this struggle between the two, that when God prescribes war, as if God realizes that, wait a minute, but I'm merciful. I can pardon these people. Okay, I need to leave something, another course to them than force. And then when he goes on to talk about his mercifulness, he realizes that is not always effective, and then the text goes back. So please excuse my dramatization of this. So this inherent struggle in the text, I think, is something that is never resolved, neither in the text of the Quran nor in the Islamic tradition, precisely because the question of war is not an easy question. And the tradition, except for a few, didn't try to make light of it and say that's the answer for it. There is a kind of war in the Quran that is a war that's launched because God decided that there should be a war. And one of the famous examples is the destruction of the first temple. And this is how it's given in verse 17:4-5. We decreed inscription to the children of Israel, you shall corrupt the earth twice and shall soar to a great height. When the time of the first promise came, we sent against you servants of ours, you are very ferocious, and they marched across your territory to slaughter you. The promise was fulfilled. So here, this is a God-dictated kind of war. But there are other kinds of war. War can also be a test for belief. Fighting has been imposed on you as a duty even though you hate it, for you might hate something which is good for you and you might like something which is harmful for you. God knows and you do not know. So fighting, war as a test of belief is another reality in the Quran. Also, war in order to force unbelievers to worship God. Tell the unbelievers to repent and God will forgive their past sins. But if they revert back, they will endure the lessons of the ancient nations. Therefore fight them until there is no longer sedition and the religion is God's. So it's not that there is one reason that the Quran gives. But due of time, I'm going to jump to what seems to be the most simple of the pronouncements of warfare, but in my opinion, is the most complicated. Here, in a nutshell, not in the Quran, but in the single verse, you see that struggle that I just described. So it says, once the sacred months are shown, kill the polytheists wherever you find them, arrest them, imprison them, besiege them, and lie in wait for them at every side of ambush. If they repent, perform the prayer, and pay the alms, let them go on their way. God is all forgiving, compassionate. And my question that I've wrestled with is how you can arrest them, imprison them, besiege them if you have already killed them. Yeah? And why start with kill and start going down from there? Is it that the pronouncement was too strong that God changed his mind and started making things more lenient to the extent that if they repent, let them go? And what adds more confusion to that, actually, what reflects more this kind of struggle, is 9.6, the verse that comes after. If a polytheist seeks your protection, grant him protection until he hears the speech of God, then escort him to where he feels safe, for they are people of no understanding. The importance here that I want really follow me in the significance of what we are examining together, this chapter 9 is essentially the last chapter that is revealed in the Quran. And the issue of war is still a struggle, is never resolved. You cannot argue that there are other verses that cancel this. This is, if anything, this cancels everything before it. And still, it's something that's not resolved. Kill the polytheists, force them to convert, or let them go by only reading to them the Quran. So what do? What is the conduct of war? To kill the polytheists? To ask them to repent, pay alms, and do the prayer, or just hear the Quran and stay polytheists? And that, if we take that as one of the last statements that we find in the Quran on war, we realize that really there is an inherent struggle that is never resolved. And if you continue, it will restart from kill and essentially with the same point. Let them go. So the continuation of chapter 9 is not any better, especially when it comes to 929. What is the point of fighting the people of the book? It's to pay jizya and accept submission. It's not to convert. So what is the point of war? Is it to convert? Is it to keep the polytheist without converting? Is it to pay the jizya? It is to duty? It's obviously not all of these. And that's a big important question, because it opens up that duty to have to go back to the Quran and restudying it, because the way the Quran got to be collected and framed our way of studying it as a book is different from this set of revelation that the Prophet Muhammad brought and shared with his followers. And these are two things. And the Islamic tradition is not the Quran. The Islamic tradition is what the followers of the Prophet Muhammad tried to make sense of the message that he received and interpreted it and developed tools of hermeneutics, a legal system, a legal thought in order to make sense of it. Voila, the mosaic of Islam. And if you look at the historic tradition, it only adds to us more confusion in that respect. Very famous case, for instance, that when we examine Islamic history, by the year 850, it becomes very evident that Muslims largely reject to fight. And the consequence of that the Muslims around the peripheries have to do wars to bring, or buy slaves to bring them to become the army, so that they fight. Yeah? And that is essentially, that blows up all these theories about war. Essentially, the Muslims largely refused to fight. And that led ultimately in 1250 to the creation of the first slave dynasty in Islam, the Mamluks. Yeah? And it never ceased to be the case. So here you have a historical record. I'm not saying that the Muslims never fought, but I'm saying that the Muslims clearly rejected enough to fight that the rulers had to find soldiers elsewhere. And that caused, by the way, lots of wars, because how do you get those soldiers? You have to go and attack and enslave, or you need to buy slaves who are enslaved through processes of war. So it is in one way or another. Modern debates on just war are as complicated, but it might suffice to quote two things, and I conclude here with these two kind of projections. Maududi, who's a very well-known ideologue among militant Muslims, in which he redefines Islam as a revolution. It's a revolutionary ideology and a program which seeks to alter the social order of the whole world and rebuild it in conformity with its own tenets and ideals. So obviously, these militants are not willy-nilly fighting. They have some kind of project. We don't agree with it, but they have some kind of a project, yeah, for which they are fighting, and in which justifies that kind. What for us sounds violence, for them is the revolution that is being done against what they consider to be this kind of injustice. So in that kind of epistemological system, militant violence is very much justified violence inside that kind of logic. But then, that is my last essential projection. But then with someone like Mahmoud Shaltut, who was a very influential jurist and reformist from Al-Azhar in Egypt, and he became the Sheikh of the Azhar, and as a result of becoming Sheikh of Azhar, his earlier writing became extremely authoritative. He wrote a manual on Islam and fighting. And in that manual, actually, he discusses a lot of what he considered to be the true teachings of Islam regarding warfare. And he says here, the purpose of warfare, according to the Quran, is limited to repelling aggression, protecting the sound of Islam, and liberty of practicing the religion. And Professor Justin Houven, just earlier, you see how much some of that language resonates with some of the language that you find in Just War theory. And I'm sure that Shaltut did not read Just War theory, but possibly some of the conversations were partly picked up from probably broader conversations about what would be a modern Just War, and other parts of it by examining the Islamic tradition, but by selectively examining the Islamic tradition, because as we just saw, the Islamic tradition is very complicated. It doesn't lend itself easily to one view or the other. And I'm sure we have time to discuss, so I can cover other areas that I'm going to be skipping over for the sake of time. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.